It's easy to make something look like an accident if you know how.
It's us. They're going to sacrifice us.
They traded blood for gold and death for life.
So, who's up for a political debate? We are talking This Land. This is directed by Richard Greenwood Jr. And yes, this is a politically themed horror movie. Now, you might feel somewhat strongly about your own political beliefs. I personally would rather politics kept out of movies for the most part, unless it's actually about politics. And this movie kind of is. But it's actually done in a somewhat clever way, I will have to say. So let me explain the plot, and then we'll kind of look at a little bit more detail. Now, this movie focuses on two families. Our kind of primary point of view family, if you like, is a left-leaning Democrat family. They are on a kind of vacation after a tragedy had befallen the mother a year before. She lost a baby due to a home invasion. So now the mother, the father, and the teenage son travel to this kind of remote forestry area where they're going to spend some time in this kind of like, log kind of cabin, etc. Get back to nature, all of that. However, when they get there, they find this cabin's already been rented out to another family. This family being a Republican family, a right-leaning family. We've got the father, who is an ex-cop. We've got the mother and their kind of teenage daughter. And of course there are differences in ideology. They try and kind of make the best of it by both kind of staying there, but obviously this does lead them to inevitable clashes. However, there is a greater threat on the horizon with this kind of cult seemingly targeting these two families for their own kind of nefarious means, and they may well have been responsible for bringing these families here in the first place. What will happen? You have to watch the movie and find out. So let's talk about what I think works in this movie. Now, I get sent these screeners quite a lot, and sometimes, I struggle to kind of keep up with them. So I work full time, so I have a job outside of YouTube. So I was going to go to work one day and I thought I would start watching this movie in the morning. I'd give it a kind of watch some of it before I went to work and catch the rest of it a little later. So I watched about a third of it in the morning, and then I went to work. And I have to say, I was really looking forward to getting back to watching the rest of it, which is a really good sign, because this movie actually, the setup of it really kind of got me quite enthralled. But I thought it was quite well handled, to be honest with you, and quite even-handed and even kind of fascinating to a certain degree. So I was pretty thrilled to be can't wait to get back and watch the rest of it. So yeah, I think this movie has a good hook. Now, politics in movies obviously are a divisive subject. You might not want to be kind of lectured to one way or the other in regards to kind of political ideologies, and I completely understand that. And I have to say, for the most part, I think movies are better off kind of avoiding that subject, unless the movie's actually kind of about politics, which this kind of is, because it's actually about these two families and their kind of differences, and to see if they can find any common ground. But here's where I think this movie does pretty well, is it tries very hard to be kind of like bipartisan, if you can imagine, or sort of very much like showing a fair representation of kind of both sides of the argument. It doesn't try to skew too much one way or the other. I mean, arguably our liberal family are the main characters, so to speak, but I have to say it didn't kind of demonise the kind of like the right side or the left side families, and actually try to kind of show differing opinions, and sometimes one might be better for one situation, or one might be better in another situation, or it's just a case of like you can have two opinions. And I've got to say it's rare for a movie to actually do this, especially a lower budget film. Sometimes these are quick kind of schedules, they're filmed pretty quick. But I have to say I thought this movie actually handled it extremely well, giving, for the most part, fair representation for both parties, which I thought was pretty good and handled pretty well. And it does kind of bring up a variety of, hot button issues, abortion, gun laws, things like this. Obviously that kind of tend to kind of dominate the headlines when talking about kind of politics and things like that. It doesn't go into every kind of, everyone, but there are certain topics that are not dwelled on, but they are kind of brought up, and we get the point of views from either kind of side. So I actually think the whole kind of political angle was handled pretty well, and as I say, I think you can it does a good job actually of showing you both sides of the argument. Now let's talk about the characters within them. Now, it does sometimes go into a little bit of a stereotype, but I still feel it kind of did a fair job, at least, with the characters. So I'm briefly going to sort of talk about the 6 kind of main characters, because I feel it's kind of like, it's a good example of how to sort of see what the movie is doing. So the kind of the liberal kind of side of it. So we have I suppose our main character is the mother, who is a black woman, and they kind of play with that kind of angry black woman kind of stereotype here, because has a very short fuse. Understandably, because she had lost a kind of a baby, but she's kind of portrayed as, say, someone who's quite quick to kind of anger and kind of, certainly probably the dominant one. Then we have a husband who is a white guy, who initially he's portrayed to be very much of a kind of like a beta male, if that makes sense. He's a kind of I think he's a professor at a university, or a teacher or something, or lecturer. Of sort of social studies and things like that, so you can kind of see where they're kind of going with that one. And then we have this kind of the teenage son, who is a little bit rebellious, but he's like sort of addicted to kind of social media, and has kind of got into a little bit of kind of trouble and stuff like that. And then on our kind of like Republican side, I mean, they are treated, they kind of go towards that sort of typical kind of like hick. That's the only thing I would say. But again, the husband is like an ex-cop, and we get some kind of like, there's some discussion about racial profiling, things like this. The mother is kind of an alcoholic, and then the daughter has a kind of her own secret that she's kind of ashamed to tell her parents because of their kind of like conservative upbringing. So we have a few different kind of like sort of points of different kind of characters with their own sort of things kind of going on. And it's interesting the relationships that these characters build. For example, like the liberal son actually gets on quite well with the conservative father, and the conservative daughter gets on quite well with the liberal mother, for example. So there's some interesting. It's not all conflict. They actually are somewhat kind of cordial to each other at times. Yes, it does boil over. And get into a few arguments and things, but I gotta say, I thought the balance was handled pretty well, and I think the acting is fair as well. I think our families do a pretty good job in their acting. I think, and some are actually pretty strong. In particular, the kind of the husband, I would say, on the kind of the left-leaning side, he really goes through a pretty good arc, and you initially think he's kind of like a kind of weak man, to be honest with you, but they actually sort of show. He has some strength in it, but it's done not in like a physical way. I thought it was pretty strong. So I actually kind of quite like I like the concept, I like the ideas, I like the characters, and I quite like the acting with those guys. So all good so far. So it makes for quite an interesting setup, and I have to say I was quite enthralled with watching this. Then we kind of layer in the horror elements, which I don't think work as well. It's an interesting idea. I don't think it worked as well. We'll come on to that in a minute. But it wasn't necessarily a bad. I think the movie as a whole was still pretty interesting, and had a good kind of entertainment value, and I think made you kind of appreciate that just people have different opinions, and there's not necessarily right or wrong, but they're just different. You can just move on with that and kind of think about kind of like bigger issues maybe. So overall, I thought this movie was fairly positive, to be honest. But what doesn't work? I actually got to say, I think the horror elements are the thing that is the weakest on this movie. So we have this kind of like this attack by these cultists. And although I don't think it was terrible, I don't think it was particularly strong. So even before we get this, there's a lot of kind of like hints about what's kind of going on. It actually kind of hints that the original attack on the kind of the mother from the kind of the liberal family might have actually been part of this kind of cult as well, although it doesn't explicitly kind of say that. But then we have these sort of like these two obvious kind of clues about what's happening. For example, the teenage girl finds a book and it literally kind of says like this cult brings together two kind of groups of people who will be at each other's throats, with the idea that they're kind of killing each other. Now that's obviously there for an exposition dump, but it literally tells you the plot of what's actually kind of going on. It's just like this woman. Well, why would you have that lying around? I mean, why would you have that kind of for someone to find? If it literally says to you, yes, this cult is going to bring two different groups of people together to try and manufacture a conflict, and they're thinking, well, that's clearly what's happened. Why have the evidence there? But it's, the reason for it is because the movie needs to give us a bunch of exposition. That's why it's there. But for the context of the story, it doesn't really kind of make any logical sense. Then we come on to this cultists themselves, and we have this very vague kind of like, kind of idea about what it is they're trying to achieve. I think the cultists, we're told, I won't say exactly because I don't want to spoil it for you, but we're given they're basically told their motivation, but I didn't really feel like that was really that particularly established. And I have to say there's a very obvious kind of twist that happens in regards to that, and they look terrible. The actual cultists look like they're wearing tablecloths, to be honest, and really dodgy paper mache animal or plastic looking kind of like masks. They look rubbish. They don't look menacing at all, and I think the acting from these characters isn't particularly good, on some of them at least. So that unfortunately undercuts it a little bit, and then becomes a little bit predictable, to be honest. And I think some of the kind of, it loses a little bit of the kind of what made this movie interesting by having this, I think, somewhat of an ill-conceived idea in regards to these kind of like these sort of cultists. Maybe we should have peppered this in a little bit earlier. I think maybe it could have been written a little stronger in kind of regard to that. And then we have this kind of, as the movie ends, as the movie kind of like sort of climaxes and stuff. Again, I don't think it quite. Again, I don't want to spoil it for you, but I don't think it quite kind of touched down in the way that you would necessarily be 100% sort of satisfied. And I thought it was a little bit kind of, it's a little bit contrived, a little bit kind of like convenient, and things kind of happen in a very sort of like, not a particularly kind of, it just seemed to happen in a very convenient way. Things like this. So, it's a little bit of a kind of, it's not a bad kind of third act, not a bad ending necessarily, but it was weaker than what I think was a pretty good setup, to be honest. I mean, other kind of like issues outside of the kind of the cultists. I mean, the Republican family really should have had some scenes on their own. I mean, we get the kind of like some scenes that are to do with our kind of liberal family, our point of view family. So we feel like we get to know them pretty well. But the kind of Republican right-leaning family are somewhat kind of short-changed, because we never really get any scenes with just them and kind of to get to know their personalities amongst themselves. We only ever really see them playing off against the other family, who are quite well established, but the Republican family isn't. So you feel like they are much more the supporting characters rather than your kind of like your main characters. I mean, some of them, like the wife, the Republican wife, I felt gets particularly kind of shortchanged in regards to kind of character development. All we really know is that she's kind of has a bit of an alcohol problem, but I don't really feel like you kind of got to know her. I would have preferred it had this movie spent a little bit more time having the screen time shared more equally between these kind of two families. Partially because then you wouldn't necessarily know who are the kind of the main characters, so to speak. Because you would, the way it goes at the moment, the kind of liberal families clearly are main characters, and the other ones are the kind of the supporting characters. but also I think it would have helped develop them into a bit more of a fleshed out kind of characters, because at the moment, as I say, they really only seem like supporting characters, and we don't, even though I think some of the kind of the scenes were pretty good, I still don't think they were particularly kind of fleshed out. And you do feel they kind of lead into that kind of typical kind of redneck kind of hunting, kind of like hillbilly hick type kind of cliche that we kind of see a lot of you know, people from the kind of like the right in America kind of fall into. So yeah, that is a little bit of a missed opportunity, but I still thought overall this movie had a lot to offer and was quite a good movie with its character work, and that's a really big thing for me. Like, you know, if you've got likeable characters, even though I don't think it completely kind of got a home run with that, it's still pretty good. And I think the setup was very interesting, and the political kind of debate side of things I think was handled very well. And the rest of it wasn't bad, it just wasn't particularly kind of stellar, really. I will give this movie an above average score overall, though, because I do think this movie, even though it has some flaws, was pretty good. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. I was leaning to a 7 when I was watching this, but I don't think the ending really sold me on a 7. So I'll give it a 6 overall. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.